Take your scriptures and turn to Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2. Just leave them open there for a moment. I want to talk to you this morning about how we become like Jesus. There was a show that Lynette and I used to enjoy called on the Food Network called Restaurant Impossible. I don't know if any of you have ever seen that show, but we got hooked on it and watched it a lot. If you haven't seen it, the premise of the show is a failing restaurant, a small restaurant in a small town typically, is a candidate for this makeover. And super chef Robert Irvine and his team have 2 days and $10,000 to do a complete makeover of this failing restaurant. He is often brutal to the owners and the managers and the service staff and the cooks. And his premise is that you're going to have to change. There's a reason that your restaurant is failing. If you keep doing what you're doing, you will cease to exist. So we're going to change. And he often has to be quite blunt with them in order to get them to see the light of their need for change. So he guts the eating area, he pulls up the flooring, he changes the light fixtures, he often changes the menu, he'll show the chefs or the cooks some new dishes, he redoes everything. It's all very dramatic, it's television, and so he yells and he takes a sledgehammer to walls and he intimidates the staff and gets them all in tears and then keeps them away from this new restaurant that he has redone for $10,000 in 2 days. And then there comes that place in the show where the big reveal occurs. And they have the owners and their family come in, and they're either blindfolded, their eyes are closed. And then there's that moment of revelation when they say, now open your eyes and see your new restaurant. And inevitably there is just tears and hugs and love all around for this new place. One thing you ought to know about these shows is that people expect to be transformed when they go on them. Or why go on them? If they didn't look different at the end of the process than they did at the beginning, then they know something went wrong. They assume transformation is normative. Change is going to happen. They expect it to happen. So here's the question for the morning. Are you ready for this? What about around here? What about a Mountain Heights Baptist Church? I'm not talking about our facility or the way we do church. I'm talking about your character and mine. Are we changing? Look in your scriptures at Philippians chapter 2, and we'll look at verse 14 for a moment. 14 says, do everything without grumbling or arguing. How are you doing with that one? Come on now, I'm looking out here. You can't lie on Sunday morning. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, he says, so that you may become blameless and pure children of God without fault in a crooked and depraved generation in which you shine like stars in the universe. Should we aim for that? Yes. Karen thinks so. She's the only one in here who thinks so. Should we expect that to happen? Can you look to the person next to you, go ahead and look at them and expect them to do everything this holiday season without arguing or complaining? Like putting up the tree, decorating the house. My wife's just giving me a stink eye like you have no idea right now. Do everything without complaining or arguing. Let's say somebody's been in this church for 5 years, and some of you have been here a lot longer than that. Should they have made some progress in this department of doing everything without complaining and arguing? Should they have made some progress in that? In 5 years, would that be at least an expectation? What kind of people are we producing around here? I've told you this before. Dallas Willard has famously said this: Your discipleship program is perfectly designed to produce the disciples you have. That ought to sober everybody up. Look at what's in our church and look at the discipleship process, and you'll see why we are the way we are. In my first pastorate in Oklahoma, I was young, late 20s. There was a crusty old man named Steve. I won't tell you his last name. But he was a charter member of a 50-year-old Southern Baptist church. Steve was mean. He was cranky and critical. I'm not sure any pastor who'd ever pastored there in their history had met his expectations. One day, in the gravel parking lot in front of the parsonage where Lynette and I lived, he came to visit me, and Steve was agitated. And he started to list off some sins that he wanted me to start preaching about in church from the pulpit. It was the standard stock list of Southern Baptist sins. You need to preach against drinking, dancing, going to movies, women wearing pants in church, and voting Republican. Because in those days, in Oklahoma, conservative Christians voted Democrat. He said, you need to do this. In what was, I'm certain, a snarky voice of mine, I said, well, that's quite a list, Steve. How about smoking? You left that one off. And he turned with a fierceness in his eyes and a filterless camel sticking in his lips and said, I don't care if Jesus Christ himself walked around the corner of that church, walked over here, and told me that smoking was a sin and not to do it anymore. He said, I wouldn't. I'd continue to smoke. So I stepped back a little bit because I figured he's going to get lightning in a minute. And I was asking God, get him, God, get him. Go ahead. But here's the thing about Steve. Steve had no intentions of changing. None. He didn't love his family that much. He didn't love other people that much. He was easily irritated. He had a judgmental spirit in him. He was legalistic. But here's what was really troubling to me. What was really troubling, it wasn't that he wasn't changing. What was troubling was that nobody really expected him to change. Oh, that's just Steve being Steve. It's just Steve. Just who he is. Nobody said we ought to call a consultant in from someplace and we ought to have an emergency meeting of the deacons to consider this strange situation where somebody who's come into our church week after week, year after year, and been doing the church thing all of those years, Sunday after Sunday, and they have not changed a bit. We need to have an emergency meeting about this because something's not being done right. Nobody. No. It's just Steve. Or it's just Bill. Or it's just Susan. It's just Vanita. It's just Rose. It's just Joe. Nobody expects that kind of change. Now, we did have certain expectations. We expected that he would affirm certain beliefs, Steve. We did expect that he would know the Bible to some extent. We expected that he would attend services. We expected that he would give some money. We expected that he would avoid certain sins. We had those expectations. But what we didn't expect that he would progressively begin to live in a way that Jesus would live if Jesus were in Steve's place. We didn't expect that. We didn't begin to expect him to begin to do everything without arguing and complaining. We didn't expect that he would shine like a star in the universe and hold on to the word of life. We didn't expect that of Steve. We don't expect people to change. Sheldon Van Alken has said this: the best argument for Christianity is Christians. Their joy, their certainty, their completeness, their wholeness, their aliveness. Then do you know what he says is the best argument against Christianity? Christians. When they're somber, joyless, self-righteous, smug, narrow, repressive, Christianity dies 1,000 deaths. Now, when Paul says, I want you to shine like stars in the universe, I want you to be pure and blameless children of God in a crooked and depraved generation, the idea there is not that the people who go to church are supposed to think of themselves as superior to those who do not go to church, but they are to be light bringers and hope bearers into this world. I don't think we often are. I think often we are the opposite of that. I think we're often critical and censorious and smug and self-righteous. I wonder how many people ache for a safe place to worship Jesus while they come to terms with some of their personal issues. But they're repelled by arrogant and angry Christians. And if you stop to think about it, Jesus did a lot when he walked this planet, trying to correct people's misinterpretation of who God was. You know that? Over and over again, you see Jesus or hear Jesus saying, you have heard it said of old, but I say to you. Do you remember this? You have heard it said, but I say to you. In other words, you've taken some of that Old Testament truth and you've twisted it. Well, let me tell you, let me straighten that out. This is who God is really like, not how you've read into the Old Testament. This is the life God really wants you to live, not how you've interpreted things. And this life is possible for you. Follow me. And so this leads me to a very personal question that I want to needle you with a little bit this morning. Are you changing? Are you different? How's your makeover going? If I could put a picture of my soul on that screen or your soul on that screen 5 years ago and then take another snapshot and put it on there of today, would we see any definitive difference? Paul says there's another kind of life that's available. But how do we pursue it? Well, this requires a certain kind of paradox, okay? I hope you understand what paradox is. Two things that seem to be contradictory, but at the same time, they work together. And Paul talks about this in chapter 2, verse 12. Look there in your Bible on your lap. Look at what he says. He says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure. Did you see that? You work out your own salvation, but it is God that works in you. That's a paradoxical relationship. Now, I cannot change myself. I cannot change Joe Chambers. Only God can do that. But I'm also not passive about this process. I don't just sit and let God, if you're going to change me, then zap me because I can't do it. There's a certain a part of this change process that I have to aggressively cooperate with the Holy Spirit about. Paul says in another place in 1 Corinthians 9, he says, do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should have become disqualified. There's a fundamental and huge difference between training to do something and trying to do something. Show of hands here. How many of you have ever run a marathon? 26.2 miles. Any? Nobody. Just me. Only dumb one in the church this morning. If you wanted to run a marathon, could you run a marathon? Let me look at this section. If you wanted to run a marathon, could you run a marathon? I mean, just like tomorrow we're going to start out here and run down to Poncha Springs. Could you do it? How about anybody in this section? Could we just start out here and... No? How many of you think if you tried really, 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 really hard, you could run all the way to Poncha Springs? Anybody? Okay, let me ask you this. This illustration's not going very well. Let me ask you this. What would be required for you to run from Buena Vista to Poncha? What would be required of you? Work with me here. Money's not the issue. Thank you. Somebody said training. We would need to train. And I can promise you, because I've run 3 marathons, I know that there have been people that are older than me that have run those marathons and have beat me in those marathons. So just because you're older than you might think you can, you could run it, but there would have to be some training involved. Would you agree with that? Just wanting to run a marathon is not the same as being able to run the marathon. Just trying really, 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 really hard and reading books about it will not get you down to Poncha Springs. What will get you to Poncha Springs is all of that understanding and all of that reading and all of that accountability. But at some point, what are you going to have to go do? Run. You're going to have to train. And that's what Paul's saying right here. You want to be godly? You can't just go to church and go, well, I hope the sermon, there's a magic bullet in there somewhere. Oh, now I'm godly. That doesn't happen that way. He says, I discipline my body to bring it into subjection. He says in 1 Timothy 4, 7 and 8, he says, train yourself to be godly. Did you see that? Train yourself to be godly. I watch Greg play this piano, and I think, I want to play that way. I love to play that way. I'm going to go over here and try to play that way. And what's going to happen? Let me tell you what you're going to hear. Here's what you're going to hear. I dropped my dolly in the dirt. You know that I dropped my dolly. That's all you'll ever hear. Because even though I want to, I have not put the hours and the scales in. The boring scales that you have to practice in order to play like that. You want to be like Jesus? You expect it to just be magic? Come on, Steve, in Oklahoma. Going to church, if that would have done it, you'd have been changed. But he wasn't. So how are we going to do this? I've got 2 training methods, 2 things. This isn't all you could do. These are just 2 ideas I want to leave you with this morning. 2. Ready? Here's discipline number 1, training exercise number 1. It's called the discipline of peace. Maybe you should remember that. The discipline of peace, or the training exercise of peace. I'm going to ask you to do something that might be difficult for you to do. It's sort of like I'm trying to get a club up to train for a race, and I'm going to ask if anyone would join me. Well, I'm not going to train for a race. I'm going to train this season of Christmas to be more peaceable. And I'm going to invite you to join me on this. And one of the ways that I have to figure out how to be more peaceable is to figure out what causes agitation in my soul. What irritates me? What bothers me? And I have to isolate that. And I'm going to make a commitment to you as my brothers and sisters in Christ and as your pastor, that through the month of December, through Advent season, I'm going to become what I hope Jesus has called us all to become. Blessed are the peacemakers. That the Prince of Peace would have such a control over my life that I would be an instrument of peace. So I'm going to fast. I'm going to abstain from trigger points of my lower angels. There are some things that I have a tendency to expose myself to that agitate me. And I'm going to abstain from that. And I'm going to call you to join me. Discipline of peace. Now, these are mine. They may not be yours, but they probably are. You hear me? They probably are. Here's one place I'm going to stay away from. Cable news. Come on now. I don't care what cable news it is. You go to the right, you go to the left, you go anywhere those. I'm going to stay away from cable news. When I hear what comes out of the White House, it triggers me. When you hear what comes out of CNN, it triggers you. It causes something to come up inside of you. It causes your teeth to grind. Whatever it is. Fox News, CNN, MSN, any of the alphabet places that you go to watch news. Be very careful about exposing that. I know some of you do this. I know you do. You sit down and eat your lunch and you turn a news channel on and it just cycles through that garbage. And you just listen to it. And even if you're not listening to it, it's in the background. You listen to talk radio, and talk radio gets you so fired up, you just can't hardly stand it. It's causing this, and how am I supposed to be an instrument of peace, and I want to bring peace to you when I've got all this going on inside me? Does that make sense? How can I be a carrier of the Prince of Peace and be so agitated? Dorothy Day said this. She said in her diary, turn off your radio, put away your daily paper, read one review events a week, and spend some time reading good books like the Bible. Do you know when she wrote that? In 1940. Do you remember what was happening in 1940? Hitler was dominating all of Europe. The nation of Japan was dominating the Pacific Rim. I mean, we were just coming out of a depression, maybe still in it a little bit. That was some crazy times. And she says, no, don't expose yourself to that. Be informed, but discipline yourself. So I'm going to fast from cable news. Second one, social media. I'm going to greatly curb my activity on and observations on social media. If what's showing up on your Facebook page causes you heartburn, curb your access to it. For instance, if you have a smartphone, you could actually take it off of your smartphone and it's not with you all the time. Now, I love seeing my grandkids on Facebook, I do, and Instagram and all that, but I don't have to just stare at that thing all day long. You can discipline yourself on that. Take yourself off of it for the month. Okay, now some of you going, I don't do that. That's what children do. Well, I'm a child, I guess. But let me tell you something some of you do. Do not forward email chains. If it's an email chain about Hillary Clinton, do yourself and your friends a favor. Delete it. Don't forward it on. If it's an email chain about Barack Obama, delete it, don't forward it on. If it's an email chain about Judge Roy Moore, delete it, don't forward it on. Don't spread that stuff. Just because it kind of fits into your political narrative, abstain from that. Do away with it. Those are triggers. Spread peace. Instead of passing along the bile that you feel about the culture, locally, nationally, globally, try sending a positive message of Scripture or a sentence prayer. I have committed to spend more time praying to God than complaining about anything else. Would you join me in that? Log more time on my knees about an issue than complaining about it to anybody. That's the discipline of peace. Do you remember those famous words of Paul? He says in chapter 4, verse 8, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think on such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put into practice, and the God of peace will be with you." Discipline of peace. And then there's the discipline of celebration. The discipline of celebration. Did you know that joy is a command? It's in chapter 4, by the way. Joy. Do you remember what it says? You could quote it. "Rejoice in the Lord," how often? Always. And then in case you didn't get it, he says, "Again, I say," what? Rejoice. Rejoice. Find delight in. I noticed this the other day. I was reading through the Old Testament, and one of the things I've noticed is, have you noticed how many times there are festivals in the Old Testament? I mean, they party like a fraternity house at Colorado University. They are always having to break their routine of their work and stop and celebrate. And they have festivals all the time. And I think part of what God was trying to show them is that you're to incorporate into your daily routine this idea that everything can be celebrated, to practice the discipline of celebration. We need to do that. You need to have at least a day a week that's a celebration day, where you wear the clothes that you love to wear, eat the foods you love to eat, listen to the music that brings you gladness, and be around people who bring you joy. Do you know there are joy bringers in your life? How many of you know of a joy bringer in your life? All right? You need to spend some time with them. How many of you know a joy sucker in your life? Don't point. That's not what we're doing here. But there are people who are black holes of joy. And in that case, what you could say to them is, "I can't be with you today. This is my joy day. I'll be with you tomorrow. Go away. Because today I can't be with you." Paul says that we can decide to rejoice. And we can enter into a training regimen to do that, to rejoice. I want to read to you my favorite story about someone in whom the gospel went deep. And this person really practiced peace and celebration. It's a long story. It's going to require patience of you. So this is a good time for you to practice patience in developing that discipline. Are you ready for this story? It's written by Tom Schmidt. Trying to Be Good is the name of the book. Listen. The state-run convalescent hospital is not a pleasant place. It is a large, understaffed, and it's filled with senile, helpless, and lonely people who are just waiting to die. On the brightest of days, it still seems dark inside, and it smells of sickness and stale urine. I went there once or twice a week for 4 years, but I never wanted to go there, and I always left with a sense of relief. It's not the kind of place you ever get used to. On this particular day, I was walking in a hallway that I had not visited before, looking in vain for a few who were alive and enough to receive a flower and a few words of encouragement. And this hallway seemed to contain some of the worst cases, strapped onto carts and into wheelchairs and looking completely helpless. As I neared the end of the hallway, I saw an old woman strapped in a wheelchair. Her face was an absolute horror. The empty stare and the white pupils of her eyes told me she was blind. The large hearing aid over one ear told me she was almost deaf. One side of her face was being eaten by cancer. There was a discolored and running sore covering part of one cheek, and it pushed her nose over to one side and dropped one eye and distorted her jaw so that what should have been the corner of her mouth was the bottom of her mouth. As a consequence, she drooled constantly. I was told later that when new nurses arrived, the supervisors would send them to feed this woman, thinking that if they could stand this sight, they could stand anything else in the building. I also learned later that the woman was 89 years old and that she'd been bedridden, blind, and nearly deaf, and alone for 29 years. Her name was Mabel. I don't know why I spoke to her. She looked less likely to respond than most of the people that I saw in the hall, but I put a flower in her hand and I said, "Here's a flower for you. Happy Mother's Day." And she held the flower up to her face and she tried to smell it. Then she spoke, and to my surprise, her words, though somewhat garbled because of her deformity, were obviously produced by a clear mind. And she said, "Thank you. It's lovely. But can I give it to someone else? I can't see it. I'm blind, you know." I said, "Of course." And I pushed her in her chair back down the hallway to a place I thought I could find some alert patients, and I found one and stopped the chair, and Mabel held the flower out and said, "Here, this is from Jesus." This is when it began to dawn on me that this was not an ordinary human being. Later, I wheeled her back into her room and learned more about her history. She'd grown up on a small farm that she managed with only her mom until her mother died, and then she ran the farm alone until 1950, when her blindness and sickness sent her into this convalescent hospital. And so for 29 years, she got weaker and sicker with constant headaches, backaches, stomach aches, and then the cancer came. Her 3 roommates were all human vegetables who would scream occasionally but never talked. And they often soiled their bedclothes, and because the hospital was understaffed, especially on Sundays when I usually visited, the stench was often overpowering. But Mabel and I became friends over the next few weeks, and I went to see her once or twice a week for the next 3 years. Her first words to me were usually an offer of hard candy from a tissue box near her bed. Some days I would read to her from the Bible and often would pause, and she would continue reciting the passage from memory, word for word. Other days I would take a book of hymns and sing with her, and she would know all the words to the old songs. For Mabel, those were not merely exercises in memory. She would often stop mid-hymn and make a brief comment about the lyrics she considered particularly relevant to her situation. I never heard her speak of loneliness or pain, except in the stress she placed on certain lines in certain hymns. It was not many weeks that I turned from a sense that I was being helpful to a sense of wonder, and I would go to her with pen and paper to write down the things that she would say. During one hectic week of final exams, I was frustrated because my mind seemed to be pulled in 10 different directions at once with all the things I had to think about. And the question that occurred to me was this: what does Mabel have to think about hour after hour, day after day, week after week, not even able to know if it's day or night? So I went to her and asked, "Mabel, what do you think about when you lie here?" And she said, "I think about my Jesus." I sat there and thought for a moment about the difficulty for me of thinking about Jesus even for 5 minutes. And I asked, "What do you think about when you think about Jesus?" And she replied slowly and deliberately as I wrote, "I think about how good he's been to me. He's been awfully good to me, you know. I'm one of those kind who mostly satisfied. Lots of folks wouldn't care much for what I think. Lots of folks would think I'm kind of old-fashioned, but I don't care. I'd rather have Jesus. He's all the world to me." And then Mabel began to sing an old song. "Jesus is all the world to me, my life, my joy, my all. He's my strength from day to day. Without him, I would fall. When I am sad, to him I go. No other one can cheer me so. When I am sad, he makes me glad, for he's my friend. And then Schmidt says this. He says, this is not fiction. And as incredible as it may seem, a human being really lived like this. I know her. I knew her. How could she do it? Seconds ticked and minutes crawled, and so did many days and weeks and months and years of pain without human company, without an explanation of why it happened. And she lay there and she sang hymns. How could she do that? And the answer, I think, is that Mabel had something that this world does not have much of. She had the gospel deep in her. And lying in that bed, unable to move, unable to see, unable to hear, unable to talk to anyone, she had incredible power. So here's an ordinary human being who received supernatural power to do extraordinary things. And her entire life consisted of following Jesus as best she could in her situation. Patient endurance of suffering. The discipline of peace. The discipline of celebration. Giving when she had some hard candy or a flower. And that was Mabel. And I wonder if that could be me. I wonder if that could be you. So that the truth of the old song actually came to life in this convalescent hospital. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And it can happen. Change can happen. But we have to practice. We have to discipline ourselves. We have to want to be like Jesus more than we want to know what's going on in Washington. We have to want to be more like Jesus more than we want to win the argument. We have to want to be like him and position ourselves to train ourselves into godliness. It won't happen just because you show up in the church. Steve already proved that. Let's pray together.